The setting sun painted the Colorado mountains gold as Thomas Morgan sat on his porch, weathered hands resting on an old Winchester rifle across his lap. At 75, his face carried the story of a hard-lived life in the West, deep lines etched by sun and wind, eyes still sharp beneath a shock of white hair. The vast meadows of his ranch stretched before him, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. The sound of running footstep broke the evening quiet. Young William, his 12-year-old grandson, raced up the path from the road, waving a telegram in his hand. The boy's face was flushed with excitement. "Grandpa, they've reached a verdict!" William called out, taking the porch steps two at a time. Thomas straightened in his chair, his heart quickening despite years of telling himself not to hope. "Give it here, son." His fingers, once steady enough to track a deer through miles of wilderness, now trembled slightly as he unfolded the yellow paper. He read the words once, then again, making sure his old eyes weren't deceiving him. After 30 years, the federal court had finally ruled against Harrison Mining Company. The land, his land, legally belonged to the Morgan family. Justice, so long delayed, had finally arrived. Thomas closed his eyes, memories washing over him like the spring floods down the Colorado River. Not the triumph of today, but the beginning. That desperate winter of 1873 when everything started. When he was a different man with a different purpose. The mountains dissolved around him as his mind traveled back through the decades. Colorado Territory, 1873. Snow fell in thick sheets, blanketing the mountain trail in treacherous white. Thomas Morgan, then 48 and in his prime, pushed his exhausted horse through the blizzard. Blood seeped through his coat sleeve where the bullet had torn through muscle. Behind him, somewhere in the white void, Harrison's men continued their pursuit. Thomas had been careless. After months of secretly documenting Harrison's illegal land grabs, one mistake had revealed his true identity. Now he was running for his life, wounded and losing blood in the merciless Colorado winter. His vision blurred as pain and cold sapped his strength. The horse stumbled on the invisible trail, nearly sending Thomas into a ravine. He knew he wouldn't last much longer in these conditions. He needed shelter, and he needed it soon. Through the curtain of white, he spotted a faint light, a cabin nestled against the mountainside. Thomas didn't know who lived there, but at this point, any roof meant survival. He turned his horse toward the light, praying whoever owned that cabin wouldn't shoot a stranger on sight, a common enough practice in these untamed territories. As consciousness faded, Thomas slipped from his saddle into the deep snow. The last thing he saw was the cabin door opening, a silhouette framed against the warm light within. Rebecca Wilson bent over her work in the dim light of Henley's boarding house. At 32, her hands were already marked by thousands of hours with needle and thread, but they remained steady and precise. The oil lamp cast long shadows as she worked late into the night, applying the final stitches to what was undoubtedly the finest buckskin coat she'd ever crafted. The rabbit fur lining was soft as a whisper against the expertly cured hide. Every seam was double-stitched with waxed thread that would hold against mountain winds for years to come. Rebecca allowed herself a small smile of pride as she examined her handiwork. In a lifetime of losses, her skill was the one thing that couldn't be taken from her. "Still at it, Wilson?" Mrs. Henley's sharp voice cut through the quiet. The boarding house owner stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her ample chest, mouth set in a permanent frown. "You know what happens if the Harrisons aren't satisfied?" "The coat is perfect," Rebecca replied, her Virginia accent still lingering despite years in the West. "Every stitch exactly as ordered." Mrs. Henley sniffed. "The Harrisons don't pay for exactly as ordered. They pay for exceptional. One complaint and you'll be out on your ear with no reference. Remember that when you deliver it tomorrow." After the older woman left, Rebecca returned to her work, adding an almost invisible inside pocket. A small embellishment not requested, but one that would mark the garment as truly exceptional craftsmanship. As she worked, she thought about what this commission meant. The Harrisons were the wealthiest family in Leadville. Their satisfaction could mean steady work through the winter. Their dissatisfaction meant homelessness in a season that killed the unprepared. Rebecca had learned survival the hard way after the war took her husband John. He'd come back from fighting for the Union a different man, jumping at sounds, waking screaming in the night, turning to whiskey to quiet whatever demons followed him home from the battlefields. 3 years after his return, she found him in their barn, his service revolver still in his hand. With nothing left in Virginia but debt and pity, Rebecca had packed her mother's sewing scissors, the only daguerreotype of her family, and headed west, where no one knew her story. 4 years later, she was still just one misstep away from disaster. She held the finished coat up to the lamp, examining every inch one final time. Perfection wasn't just pride, it was survival. Morning broke clear and cold over the mining town of Leadville. Rebecca wrapped the precious coat in oilcloth before beginning her journey to the Harrison estate. The package was heavy, the trail treacherous, but the $10 delivery fee Mrs. Henley had promised her $1 of was too important to pass up. The general store was her first stop, where old Morrison looked up from his ledger as the bell announced her entrance. "Heading up to Harrison's place?" he asked, eyeing the package. "Storm coming in from the peaks by nightfall." "I'll be back before it hits," Rebecca replied, adjusting her worn shawl. Morrison grunted. "Watch yourself up there. Some strange folk have been coming and going from that place lately. Men with city clothes and mining company badges, but hands too soft for honest work." Rebecca nodded, filing away the information. In frontier towns, gossip wasn't just pastime. It was intelligence necessary for survival. "Any news on that Land Act case?" she asked, referring to the dispute over mining rights that had the town talking. "Government's sending a new judge next month. Word is he used to be Harrison's lawyer back in California." Morrison shook his head. "Not that it matters much to folk like us. Rich men make the rules, rest of us just try not to get crushed underfoot." The trail to the Harrison estate wound through pine forest so thick that snow barely reached the ground beneath the branches. Rebecca's breath came in white clouds as she climbed, her worn boots finding purchase on frozen mud and exposed roots. The weight of the coat made her arms ache, but she kept a steady pace knowing the storm wouldn't wait. As the trees thinned, Rebecca stopped in surprise. The Harrison place wasn't the rough-hewn cabin she'd expected, but a solid two-story structure built from squared logs with real glass windows and smoke rising from two chimneys. This wasn't a miner's shack or even a successful prospector's home. This was wealth, the kind that came from controlling others' fortunes rather than building your own, the kind that could afford to discard a seamstress on a whim. Rebecca straightened her back, adjusted her grip on the package, and approached the door. Whatever waited inside, she would face it with dignity. A grizzled man in a buckskin vest answered her knock, looking her up and down with the suspicion mountain folk reserve for strangers and tax collectors. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. "Delivery for Miss Harrison. The buckskin coat from Henley's," Rebecca replied, keeping her voice steady, though her fingers were growing numb even through her mittens. He grunted and opened the door just wide enough for her to slip through. The interior was warm, almost stifling after the mountain cold. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture was rough but well made. Nothing fancy, but built to last generations. Rebecca was led to a side room where she was told to wait. Through the walls, she heard voices, a woman's sharp tone cutting through a man's lower, quieter responses. She couldn't make out words, but she recognized the sound of an argument that had been going on long before she arrived. The door opened abruptly, and a young woman swept in. Catherine Harrison wore a fine wool dress dyed deep green, expensive fabric that had come up from Denver on a freight wagon. Her hair was elaborately pinned, out of place in a mining camp where most women kept their hair in simple braids. This was someone trying very hard to prove she didn't belong here. Behind her, filling the doorway, stood a man who made Rebecca's breath catch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing wool trousers tucked into good leather boots and a heavy shirt that had seen real work. His dark hair was longer than city fashion, and his face was weathered in a way that spoke of years in high altitude and harsh wind. But it was his eyes, pale green, like creek water over stone, that held her frozen for a heartbeat too long. He looked at her not with dismissal, but with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in years. Then Miss Harrison snapped her fingers, breaking the moment. "Well, let's see it," she demanded. Rebecca unwrapped the coat with careful hands and laid it across a wooden bench. She'd put her best work into every seam, every carefully matched section of fur. The buckskin was prime, dark and thick, and the rabbit fur lining was soft as a whisper. Miss Harrison examined it with the critical eye of someone looking for flaws to justify complaint. She ran her fingers along a seam. This stitching is uneven. It wasn't. And the fur here doesn't lie flat. It did. I'm not certain this is the quality we were promised. Rebecca felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Every stitch is double sewn with wax thread. The hide was cured properly, and the lining— I didn't ask for your opinion. Miss Harrison's smile was cold. My father pays for quality, not excuses. She turned to the man in the doorway. Thomas, what do you think? Is this acceptable? The man, Thomas apparently, stepped forward. He picked up the coat with hands that knew the weight and feel of good work. He examined the seams, tested the flex of the leather, ran his palm along the fur. When he looked up, his eyes met Rebecca's. It's exceptional work, he said quietly. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with an accent that suggested education unusual for these parts. Whoever made this knows their craft. Miss Harrison's expression soured. Well, I suppose it will do, she waved her hand dismissively. Father will settle the account with Mrs. Henley. The clear implication, Rebecca wasn't worth paying directly. Rebecca wrapped the coat back up in silence, her jaw tight. She'd done quality work and been treated like she'd brought rags. It was familiar, this casual cruelty of people with money toward those who had to earn every penny. She turned to leave. Wait, Thomas's voice stopped her at the door. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pressed something into her hand. Coins, more than the delivery warranted. For your trouble, that trail's not easy in winter. Their eyes met again and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a kindred weariness. Then Rebecca was out the door, back into the cold, her hand closed tight around coins that felt like both charity and apology. The storm hit before Rebecca made it halfway back to town. Wind howled through the pines, driving snow horizontal, turning the world into a whiteout. She stumbled off the trail, her hands so numb she couldn't feel the tree trunks she used to guide herself. Her shawl crusted with ice, and her skirt hem froze stiff. When she finally saw the lights of Leadville through the snow, her legs were shaking with exhaustion and cold. She pushed through the door of Henley's boarding house, snow falling from her clothes onto the scrub floor. Mrs. Henley took one look at her and frowned. You're late. Rebecca tried to explain about the storm, but the older woman cut her off. I had a runner come from Harrison's. Says the coat was substandard, stitching uneven, fur poorly matched. That's not true, Rebecca's voice came out hoarse from cold. I double-checked I don't care about excuses. Mrs. Henley's face was stone. You know how business works up here. Rich folks complain, we lose contracts. I can't afford to lose the Harrison account. She crossed her arms. You're done, collect your things. The words hit like a physical blow. Rebecca stood dripping melted snow onto the floor, too shocked to speak. No job meant no room. No room meant no town would take her in with winter barely started. No references meant no other seamstress work. Please, Rebecca heard herself say, hating the word even as it left her mouth. You need to be gone by morning. I'll keep your last week's wages against the damage to my reputation. But Henley turned away, dismissing her like yesterday's scraps. Rebecca climbed the narrow stairs to the tiny room she shared with 2 other seamstresses. They avoided her eyes. Bad luck was contagious in a place like this. She gathered her few possessions, a spare dress, her sewing kit with the good scissors her mother had left her, a battered tin cup, and the daguerreotype of parents she barely remembered. Everything she owned fit in a canvas bag small enough to carry on one shoulder. She sat on the edge of the rope bed and stared at the candle flame, too tired even for tears. Tomorrow she'd have nowhere to go. The boarding houses wouldn't take her without work. The mining camps didn't hire women alone. And winter in the Rockies didn't forgive mistakes. A knock came at the door near midnight. Rebecca opened it, expecting one of the other girls, maybe offering stale sympathy. Instead, Thomas Morgan stood in the narrow hallway, his shoulders nearly touching both walls. His wool coat was dark with melted snow, and his hat was in his hands. Miss Wilson, he said her name like he'd learned it since their meeting. I need to speak with you. May I come in? It was improper, scandalous even in a boarding house, but Rebecca was too exhausted to care about propriety. She stepped back, and he entered, his presence making the small room feel even smaller. He didn't sit. There was nowhere to sit except the bed, and even mountain manners had some limits. I heard what happened, he said without preamble. About the job. That coat was perfect, and you know it. Catherine Harrison was looking for an excuse to refuse payment. She does it to half the traders in camp. His jaw tightened. I'm sorry you were caught in her game. Rebecca lifted her chin. I don't need your pity, Mr. Morgan. It's not pity. He turned his hat in his hands. I have a proposition. Hear me out before you refuse. Something in his tone made her pause. This wasn't the voice of a man offering shelter for the night in exchange for favors. This was something else, something stranger. I need a wife, he said bluntly. Not for love, not for comfort, for appearances. He met her eyes. I'll give you a roof, food, and safety through the winter. You'll have your own room, your own space. In return, you play the role when needed. Convince the camp that I'm settled, domesticated, no longer a threat. Rebecca stared at him. A threat to what? His smile was bitter. To certain people's business interests. It's complicated. He paused. I won't lie to you about what this is. It's an arrangement, not a romance. But it's better than freezing on the trail, and I swear on my mother's grave, I won't touch you without invitation. The candle guttered in the silence. Rebecca's mind raced. It was insane. Marrying a stranger, playing a part in some scheme she didn't understand. But the alternative was walking out into the snow tomorrow with nowhere to go. Why me, she asked. Because you're strong enough to survive what's coming, he said with certainty, as if he could see something in her she couldn't see in herself. And because you've got nothing left to lose, same as me. It was the brutal honesty that decided her. No pretty lies, no false promises, just a transaction between two people the world had cornered. I'll need my sewing kit, she said, and my mother's daguerreotype. Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. The preacher will meet us at dawn. Town clerk will file the papers. He set the paper on the small table, a simple map showing a cabin location. That's where you'll live. Where we'll live, Rebecca corrected. If she was doing this, she would be clear about terms. He nodded once. It's not fancy, but it's solid. I'll see you at first light, Miss Wilson. He left as quietly as he'd come, and Rebecca sat alone with her guttering candle, wondering if she'd just made a deal with the devil or grabbed the only lifeline in a storm. Outside, the wind howled through Leadville's narrow streets, and somewhere in the darkness, Thomas Morgan walked back to whatever shelter he had, carrying the weight of a plan Rebecca couldn't begin to understand. Dawn came cold and pale over the mountains. Rebecca stood in the town clerk's office, wearing her only good dress, dark blue wool with a white collar she'd sewn herself. Thomas wore clean clothes that were well made but deliberately plain. Wool trousers, a heavy shirt, a leather vest that had seen years of use. Nothing that suggested wealth. The preacher was a circuit rider who'd been passing through and seemed more interested in the $10 fee than the particulars of the couple. He rushed through the words while the clerk's wife and the blacksmith stood as witnesses. When Thomas slipped a simple silver band onto Rebecca's finger, sized perfectly, as if he'd known her measure, she felt the weight of it like a shackle and a shield all at once. You may kiss your bride, the preacher said automatically. Thomas's eyes met hers, asking silent permission. Rebecca gave the smallest nod. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, brief, warm, oddly gentle. It wasn't a real kiss, but it wasn't entirely false either. Then it was over, and Rebecca Wilson had become Rebecca Morgan. The transaction was complete, the contract sealed. They walked through town to where Thomas's horse was tied, a sturdy mountain-bred gelding that didn't spook at the wind. Thomas helped her up, then swung into the saddle behind her. His arm came around her waist to hold the reins, and Rebecca tried not to think about how long it had been since anyone had touched her, even this impersonally. The ride took 2 hours into higher country, following trails that weren't marked on any map. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. The cabin sat in a small valley protected by ridges on 3 sides, with a creek running through that wouldn't freeze solid even in deep winter. But calling it a cabin was like calling the Rockies Hills. It was a solid structure built from massive logs with a stone foundation and a roof that showed recent repair. There was a main room with a fireplace large enough to roast a deer, a separate sleeping room in a loft overhead. The windows had real glass. The door had iron hinges that didn't sag. "This isn't a poor man's cabin," Rebecca said quietly. Thomas dismounted and helped her down. "No, it's not." He didn't elaborate and Rebecca didn't push. She'd learn his secrets in time. Or she wouldn't. For now, she had walls around her and a fire to warm her hands. Inside, the cabin was austere but comfortable. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted. There were books on a shelf, more books than most mining camps saw in a year. A rifle hung over the door, and a bearskin covered the floor. Everything was clean, organized, almost military in its precision. "Your room." Thomas opened the door to the smaller sleeping chamber. Inside was a rope bed with a thick mattress, a chest for clothes, a small table with a basin, and a window looking out on the creek. "I'll sleep in the loft. The door has a bolt on the inside if you want it." Rebecca set down her canvas bag. The room was cold, but it was hers. "Thank you." Thomas nodded and turned away. "I'll be working the trap lines most days. There's food in the coal box outside. Venison, dried goods. Help yourself to whatever you need. If you can cook, that would be welcome, but I won't demand it." He moved to leave, then paused. "There'll be visitors sometimes, traders, men from town. When they're here, we're married. When we're alone," he shrugged, "we're just two people sharing space." "What do I call you?" Rebecca asked. "When others are here?" "Thomas," he almost smiled. "My wife should probably use my Christian name." Rebecca nodded. She had so many questions, but exhaustion was catching up to her. This strange day had drained what little reserve she had left. "Rest," Thomas said, seeming to notice her fatigue. "Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out the rest." As he left, Rebecca noticed something on the small table beside her bed. A brand new spool of wax thread and a packet of needles. The good steel kind from Philadelphia. A wedding gift perhaps, or just another part of making their arrangement look real. Either way, it was a thoughtfulness she hadn't expected. Over the following days, Rebecca learned the rhythms of the cabin. Thomas rose before dawn and returned after dark, his horse loaded with beaver pelts and marten furs. He spoke little, but he wasn't unkind. He made sure the woodpile stayed full. He brought back coffee and sugar from town without being asked. He fixed a loose board in her room without comment. And he never, not once, tried to open the door she bolted each night. Rebecca spent her days exploring the cabin's surprising comforts. The books were quality, Shakespeare, Milton, some scientific texts on geology and mining engineering. The dishes were simple but matched. The blankets were good wool, not rough trade goods. Everything whispered of money carefully hidden. She cooked because she wanted something to do. Venison stew, cornbread, dried apple pie from the stores in the cold box. Thomas ate with genuine appreciation, complimenting her skill like it mattered. They sat across the rough table from each other, two strangers playing house. One evening, as snow fell thick outside, Thomas spoke more than usual. He asked about her sewing, how she'd learned her craft. Rebecca found herself telling him about her mother, who'd made wedding dresses for Virginia society before the war changed everything. "What about you?" she asked. "Where did you learn to trap?" A shadow crossed his face. "Recently, out of necessity." "You weren't always a trapper." "No." He didn't elaborate, and Rebecca sensed a door closing. Later, as she prepared for bed, Rebecca noticed something odd. Thomas's hands, when he thought no one was watching, moved with the precise economy of someone who'd had formal education. Nothing like the rougher gestures he used when speaking to traders who visited. It was as if he was playing a role too. Not just a husband, but a particular kind of mountain man, less educated, less refined than he actually was. Rebecca bolted her door that night not out of fear of Thomas, but because she was beginning to suspect that whatever game he was playing was more dangerous than he'd admitted. And until she knew the rules and the stakes, caution was her only protection. As she drifted to sleep, the wind howled around the cabin corners, and somewhere in the darkness, secrets waited to be revealed. A week into their arrangement, a knock came at the door. Thomas's entire posture changed, becoming looser, rougher, less educated. "That'll be Morrison," he said quietly to Rebecca. "From the store. We're newlyweds, remember? Happy." Rebecca nodded and fixed her hair. She'd been a widow long enough to know how to play different roles for different audiences. She could be a newlywed if needed. Thomas opened the door with a wide smile that looked nothing like his usual careful expression. "Morrison, come in, come in. You remember my wife, Rebecca?" The old storekeeper stomped snow from his boots. "Heard you'd gone and gotten hitched, Morgan. Figured I'd bring a wedding gift." He held out a burlap sack. "Some dried peaches. Women like sweet things." "That's very kind." Rebecca took the bag with a smile. "Would you like coffee? I just made a fresh pot." They sat around the fire while Morrison caught Thomas up on camp gossip. A new claim had come in rich up past Three Sisters Ridge. The Harrison family was making noise about buying up smaller claims. The Heir was drunk more than sober these days, which meant the big operations were probably playing with the scales. Rebecca watched Thomas perform. He played the role of a simple trapper perfectly, asking obvious questions, making comments that suggested he barely understood the economics of mining. But his eyes were sharp, tracking every piece of information, filing it away. "You got yourself a good woman here, Morgan," Morrison said as he prepared to leave. "Been saying for years you needed someone to look after you since—" He trailed off awkwardly. "Since Mary," Thomas supplied, his voice carefully neutral. Yes, it was time to move forward. After Morrison left, Rebecca turned to Thomas. "Who is Mary?" "My wife," Thomas said, still staring at the door. "She died 3 years ago, avalanche and spring thaw." "I'm sorry," Rebecca said automatically. Thomas nodded once, then turned away, climbing the ladder to the loft without another word. Rebecca sat by the dying fire, processing what she'd learned. Thomas had been married before, had lost someone he loved. That part, at least, wasn't an act, but so much else was. As Rebecca banked the fire for the night, she wondered just how many layers of deception surrounded the man whose name she now shared, and what would happen when those layers were finally stripped away. The winter deepened, wrapping the mountain cabin in silence broken only by the occasional crack of branches surrendering to snow's weight. Rebecca found herself settling into the strange rhythm of her new life with unexpected ease. By her second week in the cabin, she had memorized the creaking of specific floorboards and could tell the time of day by how sunlight slanted through the windows. The cabin itself was a contradiction that grew more apparent with each passing day. While its exterior blended with other trappers' dwellings in the territory, the interior revealed careful craftsmanship and unexpected comforts. The stone fireplace drew perfectly, never filling the room with smoke like most hastily built mountain shelters. The furniture, though rustic, was constructed with joinery techniques Rebecca recognized from finer homes back east. One afternoon, while Thomas was checking his trap lines, Rebecca found herself studying the bookshelves more carefully. Works by Shakespeare and Milton shared space with technical manuals on geology and mining engineering. Several volumes on territorial law were wedged between books on fur trading and wilderness survival. This was no ordinary trapper's collection. She ran her fingers along the spines, pausing when she felt a slight irregularity in the wooden shelf itself. Pressing gently, she discovered a small catch that released a hidden compartment behind the row of books. Inside lay a leather portfolio containing documents that made her breath catch. Financial statements from banks in Denver and San Francisco. Mining claim filed under various names she didn't recognize. Contracts bearing signatures of men Morrison had mentioned in town gossip. The numbers made her head swim. Thousands of dollars, ownership stakes and claims across 3 counties, investment in the new smelter going up in Denver. One document particularly caught her eye. A detailed map of the Leadville mining district with certain parcels outlined in red ink. These parcels formed a strategic pattern surrounding larger properties marked with the initials JH. Each red outlined parcel had a date and figure noted beside it. Rebecca recognized the pattern of a man slowly encircling his enemy. Thomas Morgan wasn't just hiding wealth. He was actively growing it while pretending to barely survive. And more importantly, he was executing a careful plan against someone with those initials. Someone she suspected was James Harrison. Rebecca carefully replaced everything exactly as she'd found it and closed the hidden compartment. She wouldn't mention what she'd discovered. Not yet. But the knowledge changed something in how she viewed her arrangement with Thomas. This wasn't just a convenient marriage of necessity. She was part of something larger and potentially dangerous. That evening, when Thomas returned, she watched him with new eyes. The careful way he maintained his simple trapper persona, even when they were alone. The precision with which he cleaned his rifle. The distant look that sometimes crossed his face when he thought she wasn't watching. Who was this man whose name she now carried? The days fell into a pattern of domestic routine, punctuated by moments when Rebecca glimpsed the complexity beneath Thomas's careful facade. He taught her practical skills without condescension, how to maintain the cabin's heat by banking the fire properly, how to read weather changes in the mountains, how to keep the outdoor food cache safe from predators. Animals are predictable, Thomas explained one morning as they examined tracks in fresh snow. Bears follow scent. Wolves track movement. Men, he paused, his expression darkening, men follow greed. Rebecca studied the prints, five-toed marks with claw indentations. Mountain lion? Thomas nodded, impressed. You're learning fast. I've always been a quick study, Rebecca replied. Had to be. The world doesn't give women many second chances. Something in Thomas's expression shifted. No, it doesn't. For any of us. One evening as snow fell in thick curtains outside, Thomas surprised her by producing a small wooden box from beneath his bed. Inside was a well-maintained Smith & Wesson revolver. Time you learn to shoot, he said, placing it in her hands. Out here, it's not just for hunting. The weapon was heavy, the metal cold against her palm. Because of whoever you're hiding from. Thomas met her eyes. Because a woman alone should know how to protect herself, husband or not. He taught her with patience, explaining the mechanics, demonstrating proper grip and stance. When spring came and the snow receded enough, he promised, they would practice with actual firing. It was the first time he'd acknowledged, however indirectly, that their arrangement might not be permanent, that she might find herself alone again. The thought brought a surprising pang of regret. When morning arrived with rare winter sunshine, Rebecca decided to wash linens while the weather permitted. Outside by the creek, sheets flapping on the line strung between pine trees, she heard the approach of horses long before she saw them. Multiple riders moving fast. She abandoned the wet shirt she'd been scrubbing and ran for the cabin. Thomas was already outside, rifle in hand, but held casually, as though he'd just been cleaning it. His posture had changed, shoulders more hunched, stance wider, his entire bearing transforming into the rough-hewn trapper he pretended to be. 3 riders came into the clearing, hard men with hard faces, wearing decent clothes but carrying themselves like trouble. The leader pulled up his haughty and tipped his hat mockingly. Heard you'd taken a wife, Morgan. Civilizing yourself in your old age. Fletcher. Thomas's voice was neutral, but Rebecca saw tension in his stance. What brings you up here? Business. Fletcher's eyes slid to Rebecca, assessing and dismissive in the same glance. The Harrison Mining Company is buying up small claims. Your trap lines cross some disputed territory. Mr. Harrison wants to avoid complications. He's prepared to offer compensation for you to move your operations elsewhere. I'm not interested in selling access, Thomas said mildly. Plenty of mountain for everyone. Fletcher's smile turned ugly. See, that's not really how Mr. Harrison sees it. He's making legitimate claims legal-like. A man like you, no real stake, no capital, just scraping by. You don't want to fight that battle. Rebecca saw it then, the flash of something dangerous in Thomas's eyes. For just a second, the mask dropped, and the man underneath was someone who'd commanded respect and fear in places far from this mountain cabin. Then Thomas shrugged, and he was just a simple trapper again. Tell Harrison I'll think on it, but I'm not inclined to move. This is my home now. Fletcher dismounted slowly, his men following suit. The atmosphere shifted as the men spread out slightly. Rebecca felt her heart quicken as she recognized the tactics of men preparing for violence. Thing is, Morgan, Fletcher said, advancing a few steps, Mr. Harrison specifically mentioned you by name. Now that struck me as odd. Man like him knowing a simple trapper personally. His eyes narrowed, almost like you two had history. Thomas's expression remained impassive, but Rebecca noticed his grip tightening on the rifle. Don't know what you're talking about. Never met the man. Fletcher chuckled. Funny, he seems to know you mighty well. Said you might be using a different name these days, but I'd recognize you. Said you were educated. Said you'd be hiding something valuable. One of Fletcher's men, it circled toward the cabin door. Thomas shifted position, keeping all three men in his line of sight. Sounds like your boss has me confused with someone else, Thomas said evenly. I'm just a trapper, trying to make a living. Nothing valuable here except peace and quiet, which you're currently disturbing. Fletcher leaned forward in his saddle. You're making a mistake. Harrison doesn't ask twice. He glanced at Rebecca again. Pretty wife you got. Be a shame if something happened to her while you were out running your trap lines. Mountains are dangerous places. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas's grip on the rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. I think you should leave now, before you say something you can't take back. The two men locked eyes. Rebecca held her breath, waiting for violence. One of Fletcher's men had his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Then Fletcher laughed and turned to his horse. We'll be seeing you, Morgan. Soon. Mr. Harrison doesn't like unfinished business. As they mounted and prepared to leave, Fletcher called over his shoulder. By the way, how's that shoulder? Bullet wound heal up all right? Rebecca saw Thomas flinch almost imperceptibly. Fletcher's parting smile confirmed he'd seen it too. The three riders galloped out, leaving torn mud in their wake. Thomas stood motionless until the sound of hooves faded. Then he lowered the rifle and turned to Rebecca. His face was drawn tight. Pack a bag. Essential things only. We're going into town. Thomas, what? Rebecca. The command in his voice was absolute. Please. As she hurried inside, Rebecca's mind raced. Bullet wound? She'd never seen Thomas injured, and yet Fletcher seemed certain. Another piece of the puzzle that was her husband, and one that suggested the danger surrounding him, was far more immediate than she'd realized. They rode into Leadville in silence, Thomas pushing the horse faster than was safe on the muddy trails. Snow had begun falling again, fat flakes that promised another heavy storm before nightfall. Rebecca clung to Thomas's waist, questions burning in her throat, but held back by the rigid tension in his body. He took her straight to Morrison's store and pulled the old man aside for a whispered conversation. Morrison's eyes widened, then he nodded slowly. She can stay in the room above the store, Morrison said. My daughter Sarah's there now. They'll be fine together. But Morgan, if this is what I think. It is, Thomas said. He turned to Rebecca. You'll be safe here. Morrison's daughter Sarah is good company. I'll be back in 3 days, 4 at most. Rebecca grabbed his arm. Tell me what's happening. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a decision. He led her to the back room of the store where they could speak privately. James Harrison and I have history, he began, his voice low. Before I came here, before my wife died, I was a partner in a mining operation in California. Harrison was another partner. When the claim came in rich, he wanted control. Thomas's voice was flat, reciting facts. He arranged an accident at the mine that killed 3 men. One of them, my best friend. Rebecca's hand tightened on his arm. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. I sold out, took my money, and disappeared before he could arrange an accident for me too. His jaw tightened. Then he followed the silver rush to Colorado, built his empire on other people's claims, same as before. When he found out I was here, even living like this, he couldn't resist the chance to grind me down completely. How did he find you? Rebecca asked. Thomas's expression turned grim. I made a mistake. I visited Denver 3 months ago to check some records at the land office. Someone recognized me. Word got back to Harrison. His hand unconsciously touched his left shoulder. His men ambushed me on my way back. I took a bullet but managed to escape. Rebecca's mind flashed to the careful way Thomas sometimes moved, the nights he'd wince when stretching his arm. That's why you needed a wife, she whispered. Not just for appearances. You needed someone at the cabin while you were injured. At first, yes, Thomas admitted, but it became more than that. He met her eyes. I've been preparing for this confrontation for years. I've been buying up those claims Harrison wants, using proxies and shell companies. I own more mineral rights around Leadville than anyone except Harrison himself. The papers in the cabin, Rebecca whispered. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Yes, I'm not poor, Rebecca. I'm one of the wealthiest men in Colorado Territory. But if Harrison knows that, if he knows I'm his biggest competitor, he'll come after me with everything he has. He paused. And he'll use you to get to me. The pieces fell into place. The isolated cabin, the deliberate poverty, the convenient marriage to a woman no one would miss if something happened. Except somewhere along the line, it had become real. Rebecca had stopped being a prop in his scheme and started being a person he wanted to protect. "I can help," Rebecca said. "I'm not some helpless—" "I know you're not helpless." Thomas's voice was rough. "That's why I need you safe while I handle this. Harrison plays dirty. I need to know you're somewhere he can't reach." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This is a letter of credit. If something happens to me, Morrison has instructions to get you on a coach to Denver. You'll have enough money to start over anywhere you want." Rebecca stared at the paper. "You think he'll kill you?" "I think he'll try." Thomas's smile was grim. "But I've been planning this confrontation for 3 years. I'm not the same man who ran from California." Rebecca looked at the letter of credit. $5,000, more money than she'd ever imagined possessing. Enough to establish a new life anywhere in the country. "What about us?" she asked softly. "This arrangement, this marriage." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or something deeper. "That was never meant to be real. I've put you in enough danger already." He touched her cheek, gentle and brief. 3 days, 4 at most, stay here." Then he was gone, riding back up into the mountains where snow was already obscuring the trails. Rebecca was left standing in Morrison's store with her small bag and a letter of credit that felt like a farewell. Sarah Morrison was a cheerful woman in her 30s who asked no questions and offered simple kindness. She gave Rebecca a spare dress and a place at her table. They played cards and talked about nothing important, and Rebecca tried not to watch the clock or the window. "You know," Sarah said on the second evening as they sewed by lamplight, "that husband of yours isn't what he pretends to be." Rebecca's needle paused mid-stitch. "What do you mean?" "Father's known him 3 years. Says he came into town half dead from cold, with a bullet in him and men on his trail." Sarah's fingers moved deftly, securing a button. "Father helped him because he said Harrison's men were after him. My father hates Harrison more than anyone. Lost our mountain claim to him when I was just a girl." Rebecca carefully set down her sewing. "Your father knew Thomas was hiding?" Sarah nodded. "Most of the old-timers in town know something's not right about him. Man with his education don't usually end up trapping unless he's running from something. But they respect him because he stands his ground, and they all hate Harrison." This changed things. Thomas wasn't just hiding from Harrison. He had allies. People who knew, at least partially, who he really was. "The day after you two got married," Sarah continued, "Fletcher and his boys were asking all over town about Morgan's new wife, where you came from, whether you had family nearby." Her eyes met Rebecca's. "They don't know it yet, but they're more afraid of him than he is of them." Before Rebecca could respond, a commotion downstairs interrupted them. Sarah moved to the small window overlooking the street. "Speak of the devil," she murmured. Rebecca joined her at the window. A well-dressed man was entering the store, flanked by 2 others she recognized from Fletcher's group. Even without being told, Rebecca would have known this was James Harrison. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man accustomed to having his way. "Stay here," Sarah whispered, heading for the stairs, but Rebecca followed quietly, stopping at the landing where she could hear without being seen. Harrison's voice carried clearly. "Just a friendly visit, Morrison. Heard Morgan's wife is staying with your daughter. Thought I'd pay my respects." "She's resting." Morrison's voice was cold. "Doctor's orders." "Nothing serious, I hope." Harrison's concern sounded genuine to anyone who didn't hear the underlying threat. "Just women's troubles. Nothing that concerns men like us." Rebecca almost smiled at Morrison's quick thinking. Nothing would make a man of Harrison's generation retreat faster than the suggestion of female ailments. "Well, when she's feeling better, let her know I'd like to speak with her. Business proposition that might benefit her husband." "I'll tell her." After Harrison left, Rebecca descended the rest of the stairs. Morrison looked up, not surprised to find she'd been listening. "He'll be back," the old man said grimly. "Man like that doesn't give up easily." "No," Rebecca agreed, "but neither do I." On the second day, a different man came into the store, well-dressed, with cold eyes and a colder smile. He bought tobacco and chatted with old Morrison about the weather, but his gaze kept sliding to the stairs that led to Sarah's rooms. "That Morgan's wife?" he asked casually. "Heard he married some seamstress. Hard times make for strange bedfellows." Morrison's face was stone. "That's none of your concern." The man smiled and left. Rebecca, watching from the top of the stairs, felt ice in her stomach. They knew she was here. Thomas's precautions hadn't been enough. That night, Rebecca sat by the window in Sarah's room, unable to sleep. She'd spent months being protected, being shielded, being treated like something fragile. But she'd grown up poor in a hard world. She'd survived winters and hunger and the casual cruelty of people with power. She'd buried a husband broken by war and started over with nothing but her skills. She'd be damned if she'd hide now. Just before dawn, Rebecca overheard two of Harrison's men talking outside the store, unaware their voices carried through the slightly open window. "Morgan's supposed to check his claim at Devil's Pass tomorrow. Boss wants us to make sure he has an accident." "What about the woman?" "Fletcher says leave her be for now. Harrison has plans for her after Morgan's gone." Rebecca felt cold resolve settle in her stomach. Thomas was riding into a trap, and she was tired of being a pawn in men's games. By dawn, Rebecca had a plan. It was risky, probably stupid, but it was action. She couldn't just wait for men to decide her fate. She borrowed paper and pen from Sarah and wrote 3 letters. Careful, specific letters that would shake the foundations of Harrison's empire if they reached the right people. Then she walked into the Lion's Den. The Harrison Mining Company offices occupied the largest building in Leadville, 2 stories of imported lumber with a real shingle roof. It towered over the neighboring structures like a physical manifestation of Harrison's dominance over the town. Rebecca pushed through the door as though she belonged there, her spine straight and her chin high. The clerk looked up in surprise. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I'm here to see Mr. Harrison," Rebecca said clearly. "Tell him Mrs. Thomas Morgan would like to discuss a business proposition." The clerk's eyes widened. He disappeared into a back office and returned a moment later. "Mr. Harrison will see you." James Harrison sat behind a massive desk in a room designed to intimidate. He was a big man running to fat, with expensive clothes and cheap eyes. He smiled when Rebecca entered, but it didn't reach those eyes. "Mrs. Morgan, what an unexpected pleasure. Please sit." He gestured to a chair positioned deliberately lower than his own. "I'm afraid your husband and I have some business differences. I hope you're not here to plead his case. It would be unseemly." Rebecca sat with perfect posture, meeting his eyes. "I'm not here to plead anything. I'm here to make you an offer." Harrison leaned back, amused. "Is that so?" "My husband owns mineral rights to 17 claims surrounding your current operations. Claims you need if you want to expand your smelting operation without losing 3 months hauling ore over bad roads." Rebecca kept her voice steady. "I'm prepared to sell you those rights for a fair price." Harrison's amusement faded. "Your husband would never agree to that." "My husband doesn't know I'm here." Rebecca pulled the papers from her bag, copies she'd found in the cabin weeks ago when she discovered Thomas's secret. "These are registered in proxies' names, but the ownership ultimately traces to Thomas Morgan. I've done the research. The trail is complicated, but it's there." She leaned forward. "Here's what I know, Mr. Harrison. You tried to buy out my husband in California. When he refused, you killed 3 men and blamed it on an accident. Thomas ran because he couldn't prove what you'd done, but he took his money with him. Money he's been using to buy the very ground you're standing on." Harrison's face darkened. "You're making serious accusations." "I'm stating facts." Rebecca's voice was ice. "And here are more facts. I have 3 letters ready to mail. One goes to the territorial governor with documentation of the California mine accident and some interesting coincidences with recent accidents at your operations here." She continued. "One goes to the Denver newspapers with a detailed account of your business practices. And one goes to your investors in San Francisco informing them that the expansion they're funding is built on legally questionable claims." She set the papers on his desk. "Or you can buy these 17 claims for a fair price, say $30,000, and I make sure those letters never get sent. You get the land you need, I get enough money to disappear somewhere you'll never find me. And Thomas gets to keep his trap lines and his quiet life since he won't own anything you care about anymore." Harrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for a crystal decanter on his desk and poured himself a measure of amber liquid. He didn't offer Rebecca any. "You know," he said, swirling the liquor, "I had a very different impression of you. Fletcher reported you were just some desperate seamstress Morgan married for convenience." His eyes narrowed. "Clearly, he underestimated you." "Most men do," Rebecca replied evenly. "It's their greatest weakness." Harrison took a slow sip. "These letters you mention, they must contain quite compelling evidence. Compelling enough to cause questions. Questions lead to investigations. Investigations lead to people examining your business practices more carefully." Rebecca smiled thinly. "Rich men like you don't stay rich when people start looking too closely at how you made your money. And if I refuse, then my husband confronts you directly, with everything he knows, which I'm told is considerable." Harrison's face remained impassive, but Rebecca saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing options, considering angles. 30,000 is steep for unproven claims. Those claims control access to your primary shaft. Without them, your ore has to travel an extra 20 miles to reach the smelter. At current silver prices, that costs you approximately $3,000 per month in additional expenses. Rebecca folded her hands in her lap. "The claims will pay for themselves in less than a year." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "You seem well versed in mining economics for a seamstress." "I learned quickly." The silence stretched like a drawn blade. Harrison's face had gone red, then pale. "You're bluffing." "Try me." Rebecca stood. "You have until tomorrow noon to decide. After that, the letters go out." She walked to the door, then turned back. "One more thing. If anything happens to my husband or to me, Morrison has instructions to send those letters immediately. So don't get creative." She walked out of the office on shaking legs, but she kept her head high until she was around the corner. Then she leaned against a wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might be sick. She'd just gambled everything on a bluff built on half-understood papers and pure audacity. If Harrison called it, she was dead. If Thomas found out before it was over, he'd be furious. And if her plan actually worked, she had no idea what came after that. Rebecca made it back to Morrison's store and up to Sarah's room before her legs gave out. She sat on the bed, staring at nothing, trying to process what she'd just done. Part of her couldn't believe her own audacity. The other part, the part that had survived years of hardship, knew she'd do it again. Sarah brought tea and asked no questions. Bless her, as sunset painted the mountains gold and purple, Rebecca heard the sound she'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. A single horse ridden hard, stopping outside the store. Thomas took the stairs 3 at a time. He burst through the door with fury and fear written equally on his face. "What the hell did you do?" Rebecca stood to face him. "What I had to." "You went to Harrison, Morrison told me." "Yes." "Do you have any idea how dangerous?" "Yes." Rebecca cut him off. "I know exactly how dangerous. Just like I know you were riding into a trap. Fletcher and his men were planning to ambush you at Devil's Pass. Did you really think Harrison would face you directly?" Thomas stared at her. "How did you—" "I overheard 2 of his men talking at the store yesterday. They thought I was just Morrison's seamstress friend. Nobody important." Rebecca crossed her arms. "You taught me to track animals. Turns out tracking men isn't that different. And men underestimate women, which makes us very good at gathering information." Thomas sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "What did you offer him?" Rebecca told him everything. The bluff about the letters. The offer to sell claims she didn't actually control. The $30,000 price. When she finished, Thomas was staring at her with an expression somewhere between horror and awe. "Those letters, do they actually exist?" "Yes, I wrote them last night." Rebecca lifted her chin. "The documentation isn't perfect, but it's enough to cause problems. Enough to make his investors nervous. Enough to tie him up in investigations for months, maybe years. He can't afford that kind of scrutiny. Not with the kind of business he runs." She sat across from him. "And if he doesn't pay, then I mail the letters and we run like hell." Rebecca met his eyes. "I'm not helpless, Thomas. I know you married me to play a role, but somewhere along the line, I stopped being an actress and started being your partner, whether you wanted one or not." Thomas looked at her for a long time. Then unexpectedly, he laughed. A real laugh, rough with surprise and something that might have been relief. You magnificent, terrifying woman. Do you know what you've done? Probably ruined your carefully laid plans and put us both in danger. Or ended a war before it started. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes bright. I was going to confront Harrison, force a showdown. Best case, I'd win, but have to reveal who I really am, which means every claim jumper and con artist in the territory would come after me. Worst case, I'd end up in an unmarked grave and you'd have to use that letter of credit to escape. He shook his head in wonder. You found the third option. Make him pay for peace, then disappear. It's brilliant. It's absolutely insane, but it's brilliant. So you're not angry? Thomas stood and crossed to her. He took her hands in his, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I'm furious that you risked yourself, and he struggled for words. I'm humbled. You didn't have to do this. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is, Rebecca said quietly. Maybe it started as a business arrangement, but it's not that anymore, is it? The question hung between them. Thomas's thumbs rubbed circles on her palms, and she could feel the calluses from months of trap lines and hard work. When he spoke, his voice was rough with honesty. No, it's not that anymore. He lifted one hand to her cheek, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like that first quick press of lips at their wedding. This was heat and need and months of tension breaking like a dam. Rebecca kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt. This was real, the desire, the connection, the sudden blazing certainty that somewhere in their practical arrangement, something true had grown. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. If we do this, if we become real, it changes everything. I know, Rebecca whispered. I'm not afraid of change anymore. The next morning, a messenger delivered an envelope to Morrison's store. Inside was a bank draft for $30,000 and a terse note. The claims are yours. Consider our business concluded. Rebecca and Thomas stood side by side looking at the draft. It represented freedom, safety, the ability to go anywhere and be anyone. It also represented the end of hiding. What do you want to do? Thomas asked. Rebecca thought about the question. For months, she'd been surviving, playing a role, accepting protection, but she'd proven to herself that she was more than that. She didn't need rescue. She was perfectly capable of doing the rescuing herself. I want to stay, she said, not in the cabin hiding, but here in the territory. I want to use some of this money to start a real business, a seamstress shop that treats workers fairly and pays them honestly. I want to build something. Thomas smiled. And where do I fit into these plans? Rebecca turned to him. Wherever you want. As my partner in business, if you're interested. As my husband for real, if you're willing. Or as my friend, if that's all you can offer. She met his eyes. I don't need you to take care of me, Thomas, but I'd like you beside me while I take care of myself. Thomas pulled her close, and this time the kiss was tender rather than desperate. When they broke apart, he was smiling, really smiling, in a way she'd never seen. Partner it is, he said, in business and everything else. Though I should warn you, I'm a terrible seamstress. Then you can handle the numbers while I handle the needle. Rebecca grinned. We make a good team. We do, Thomas agreed. God help anyone who gets in our way. Spring came to the Colorado mountains with sudden ferocity. Snowmelt turned streams into raging torrents, and mud claimed the paths where snow had once lain thick. Leadville stirred from its winter slumber as supply wagons began making their way up from Denver, bringing goods and news from the outside world. Rebecca Morgan stood in front of her newly purchased storefront on Harrison Avenue, savoring the irony of opening her business on the street named after the man she'd outmaneuvered. The building was modest compared to the grander establishments nearby, but it was solid brick with large windows to allow in natural light, essential for fine sewing work. What do you think? Thomas asked, coming to stand beside Heir's. The last month had changed him subtly. He stood straight or spoke with less affected roughness. The trapper disguise had been shed, though he maintained enough frontier practicality to avoid drawing undue attention. I think it's perfect, Rebecca replied, her eyes tracing the freshly painted sign above the door. Morgan's Fine Tailoring and Dressmaking. Thomas produced a small wooden box from his pocket, a shop-warming gift. Yet inside nestled a brass key with an ornate handle, clearly custom-made. For the front door, Thomas explained, I had the locksmith create something special. Rebecca turned the key over in her palm, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not just a business, her business. Something built with her own skills, backed by her own confidence. Something no one could take from her. Thank you, she said, voice thick with emotion. Thomas cleared his throat. There's something else. While the shop was being prepared, I took the liberty of placing some advertisements in the Denver papers for skilled seamstresses. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. You did? You mentioned wanting to hire women who needed fair employment. I thought, he hesitated, I thought you might want to get started right away. 3 days later, Rebecca interviewed 7 women for positions in her shop. She hired 3. Mary, a widow with 2 young children. Elizabeth, a young woman with a scarred face from a mining accident who had been unable to find work elsewhere despite her exceptional skill with embroidery. And Sarah, Morrison's daughter, who surprised Rebecca by applying. I've been helping Father with the books for years, Sarah explained, but I'd rather work for a woman who understands what it means to build something from nothing. As April turned to May, Morgan's established itself as a respected business in Leadville. Rebecca insisted on fair pricing, but exceptional quality, and word spread quickly. Mining company executives sent their wives to have dresses made. Shop owners ordered sturdy but well-tailored work clothes. Even some of the more successful prostitutes from the cribs on State Street came by, willing to pay premium prices for garments that combined durability with beauty. Thomas, meanwhile, had quietly transformed from a reclusive trapper into a shrewd businessman. He maintained their cabin in the mountains as a retreat, but purchased a modest house in town where they now lived most days. He handled the financial aspects of Rebecca's shop and made careful investments with their substantial capital. Yet despite their success, Rebecca couldn't shake a persistent uneasiness. Harrison had retreated too easily. His capitulation felt incomplete, his absence from town affairs conspicuous. You're watching the door again, Thomas observed one evening as they closed the shop. Rebecca sighed. I keep expecting Fletcher or one of Harrison's other men to walk through it. Thomas secured the lock, testing it twice. Harrison isn't a man who forgives a defeat, but he's shrewd enough to recognize when a direct approach has failed. You think he's given up? No, Thomas said bluntly. I think he's changing tactics. Rebecca drew her shawl tighter despite the mild evening air. What would you do if you were him? Thomas considered the question. I'd look for new pressure points, new vulnerabilities. His eyes met hers, which is why we need to be vigilant about protecting what matters to us now. The warning proved prescient. 2 weeks later, Rebecca arrived at the shop to find the front window shattered, glass fragments glittering across the wooden floor like malevolent diamonds. Inside, bolts of expensive fabric had been slashed, sewing machines damaged, and completed customer orders ruined with spilled oil. Nothing was stolen, noted Sheriff Coleman, a heavy-set man with a perpetually damp mustache who had responded to their summons with suspicious speed. Looks like simple vandalism to me. Probably drunks or bored miners. This wasn't random, Thomas said quietly, examining a particular pattern of damage. Every single order for the wives of mining executives had been singled out for destruction. The sheriff shrugged. Can't prove otherwise. I'll ask around town, see if anyone saw anything. His tone made it clear he expected to find nothing. After he left, Rebecca knelt to gather remnants of a blue silk gown commissioned by Mrs. Donovan, wife of the Second Continental Bank's manager. The delicate fabric, which had been shipped at great expense from New York, was beyond salvage. We have to tell our customers, she said, straightening. Some of these orders were for special events. They'll need time to make other arrangements. Thomas's expression darkened. That's exactly what they want. For word to spread that you can't deliver. For your reputation to suffer. Rebecca squared her shoulders. Then we'll have to disappoint them, won't we? Over the next 72 hours, Rebecca and her seamstresses worked without stopping, except for brief naps on cots set up in the back room. Thomas hired 2 men from the mining camp, veterans he trusted, to stand guard. New glass was installed in the window, new locks on the doors. When Mrs. Donovan arrived to check on her dress, Rebecca presented her not with excuses but with a completed gown of even finer silk, sourced from Thomas's emergency trip to Denver. "But how?" Mrs. Donovan marveled, running her fingers over the exquisite stitching. "Sheriff Coleman said everything was destroyed." "We had some inventory in our home storage," Rebecca lied smoothly. In truth, the dress represented 3 days without sleep and a small fortune in express delivery fees. "Well, it's magnificent," Mrs. Donovan declared. "I shall make sure everyone at the Bankers Association dinner knows exactly where it came from." Similar scenes played out with each customer. By week's end, not a single order was delivered late, though Rebecca and her staff were near collapse from exhaustion. "You've made your point," Thomas said as they finally closed the shop Friday evening. "You won't be intimidated, but this was just the first move." Rebecca nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. "We need to prepare for what comes next." The answer came 3 days later when Mary failed to appear for work. Elizabeth reported that Mary's landlord had evicted her suddenly, claiming he'd received a better offer for her rooms, an unheard-of occurrence in Leadville where housing was scarce. By the following day, Sarah reported that her father was facing difficulties with suppliers. Suddenly, shipments scheduled for Morrison's store were being rerouted to other merchants or delayed indefinitely. "They're targeting everyone connected to us," Thomas concluded grimly, "punishing the town for doing business with us." Rebecca paced their small parlor that evening, frustration building. "This is how Harrison operates? Not direct confrontation, but petty harassment? Hurting innocent people to get to us?" "It's effective," Thomas noted. "People will eventually decide we're not worth the trouble. They'll distance themselves to protect their own interests." Rebecca stopped pacing. "No, I refuse to let that happen. We need to respond, but not just defensively. We need to show Leadville that being associated with us brings more benefits than problems." "What are you suggesting?" A determined smile spread across Rebecca's face. "I think it's time the Morgan family became known for its generosity and its influence." The next morning, Rebecca visited the offices of the Leadville Chronicle with a proposition. She would purchase a full-page advertisement announcing the establishment of the Morgan Fund for Mining Families, a charity dedicated to supporting widows and children of men killed or injured in mining accidents. The initial endowment? $5,000. That's a substantial sum, Mrs. Morgan, the newspaper editor commented, eyebrows raised. "Mining has been good to this region," Rebecca replied. "It seems only right that those who profit should help those who suffer for it." The announcement created immediate buzz in Leadville. While charity wasn't unknown in mining communities, such a public and substantial commitment from relative newcomers raised questions and eyebrows. Thomas, understanding Rebecca's strategy, arranged meetings with several influential mine operators not directly affiliated with Harrison. He proposed a matching fund program. For every dollar their companies contributed to the Morgan Fund, he would personally match it. "Good business and good publicity," he explained to skeptical executives. "Shows your men you value their safety and their families." Within a week, 3 of the 5 independent mining operations in Leadville had agreed to participate. Their contributions, matched by Thomas, swelled the fund to nearly $15,000. Rebecca, meanwhile, hired Mary as the fund's administrator, providing her with a salary generous enough to secure new lodging. She also arranged for Elizabeth's younger brother, who had been working dangerous shifts in a mine, to be apprenticed to a skilled carpenter in town. "You're building a network," Thomas observed admiringly as they reviewed the growing list of fund beneficiaries and contributors. "I'm building community," Rebecca corrected. "Harrison isolates and intimidates. We'll connect and support." The strategy bore fruit faster than either had anticipated. When Harrison's men attempted to pressure the local mercantile into refusing to sell supplies to Morgan's Tailoring, the owner stood firm. His son had just received one of the first scholarships from the Morgan Fund to attend school in Denver. When pressure was applied to the boarding house where Elizabeth lived, the landlady publicly declared she wouldn't be intimidated. Her late husband had been one of the miners killed in the Carbonate King collapse, and the Morgan Fund was helping her keep her business afloat. Each attempt at isolation was met with community resistance. Slowly, the tide of public opinion turned in the Morgans' favor. Harrison's response came in the form of Catherine Harrison, who appeared at Morgan's Tailoring one quiet afternoon. Rebecca was alone in the shop, the other seamstresses having left for a late lunch. "Mrs. Morgan," Catherine said, her voice lacking its former arrogance, "I believe we need to talk." Rebecca set aside her work carefully. "Miss Harrison, this is unexpected." Catherine glanced around the empty shop, then leaned forward. "My father is planning something terrible. I thought you should know." "Why would you warn me?" Rebecca asked cautiously. "Because I've seen what he does to people who challenge him." Catherine's eyes held a haunted look. "And because I'm tired of being part of it." She explained that Harrison had returned to Denver after their confrontation, but hadn't accepted defeat. He'd been meeting with unsavory men, planning something that would teach the Morgans a lesson they'd never forget. "He's always been ruthless in business," Catherine said, "but this is different. He's consumed by it now. Obsessed." "Thank you for the warning," Rebecca said. "But why now? Why turn against your father?" Catherine looked away. "Thomas was kind to me once, when I first arrived in Leadville before I understood what my father expected of me." She hesitated. "And the Morgan Fund helped Mrs. Cooper, the widow of my father's former partner. I didn't know about that, about what he'd done in California." As Catherine left, Rebecca pondered this unexpected alliance. When Thomas returned, she shared the warning. "Do you believe her?" he asked. "Yes," Rebecca replied. Her eyes held genuine fear. Whatever Harrison is planning, it frightened his own daughter enough to betray him. They doubled the guards on both shop and home, and Thomas began discreetly arming trusted allies throughout town. Yet despite their precautions, they couldn't anticipate the form Harrison's revenge would take. July brought scorching heat that turned Leadville's muddy streets to dust. The mountains, so recently blanketed in snow, now stood brown and parched against the relentless blue sky. Fire danger signs posted at the edge of town changed from moderate to extreme as week after dry week passed without rain. Rebecca had just closed the shop for the evening when she noticed the acrid smell of smoke. Not the usual wood smoke from cooking fires, but something sharper, more chemical. "Fire!" The shout came from down the street, followed by the clanging of the town's alarm bell. Thomas, who had been reviewing ledgers in the back room, emerged quickly. "Where?" Rebecca was already at the door, peering out. Orange flames illuminated the darkening sky 2 blocks away. "It looks like State Street." They rushed toward the commotion, joining the human chain passing buckets from the water pump to the burning buildings. 3 structures were already fully engulfed: a saloon, a brothel, and a small hotel frequented by miners. "The wind's pushing it this way," someone shouted over the roar of the flames. "Harrison Avenue could be next." Rebecca's heart sank. Their shop lay directly in the potential path if the fire continued to spread. For hours they worked alongside townspeople, fighting the relentless advance of the flames. Rebecca's arms ached from passing heavy buckets, her lungs burned from the smoke, but she refused to stop. Thomas had disappeared into the hotel earlier, emerging repeatedly with disoriented residents who'd been trapped inside. By midnight, the fire was finally contained, though several buildings had been reduced to smoking rubble. Exhausted, filthy, and smoke-stained, Rebecca sat on a bench across from what remained of the hotel. Thomas found her there, his face blackened with soot, shirt singed in several places. "Everyone got out," he reported, sitting heavily beside her. "Some burns and smoke inhalation, but no deaths." Rebecca leaned against his shoulder. "Thank God." They sat in silence, watching as volunteers continued to douse hot spots. Then a conversation nearby caught their attention. "Started in the back room of the Golden Nugget," a man was saying. "Pete from the livery saw 2 men running out just before the flames went up. Said one of them looked like Fletcher's boy, the one with the scar." Thomas stiffened beside her. Rebecca felt her exhaustion evaporate, replaced by cold fury. "Harrison," she whispered. "We can't prove it," Thomas cautioned, though his expression had hardened. "We don't need to prove it. Everyone in town will draw the same conclusion." The next morning, as Leadville assessed the damage in the harsh light of day, Rebecca and Thomas called an emergency meeting of the Morgan Fund's contributors. In the back room of Morrison's store, now openly allied with the Morgans, they made their proposal. "The fund will offer immediate assistance to everyone displaced by the fire," Rebecca explained. "Housing subsidies, replacement of essential items, medical care for the injured." That's potentially dozens of people, one mine operator objected. The fund wasn't intended for this scale of disaster, which is why we're adding another $10,000 to the endowment, Thomas countered, and asking each of you to consider a special contribution. The mine operators exchanged glances. This fire, there are rumors about how it started, one said carefully. There are always rumors, Thomas replied neutrally. What matters is how we respond as a community. By afternoon, the Morgan Fund had established a relief center in a vacant storefront. Rebecca and her seamstresses distributed blankets, clothing, and food. Thomas arranged temporary housing in vacant rooms throughout town. Morrison provided essential supplies at cost. The response was swift and comprehensive, and entirely public. No one mentioned Harrison by name, but the contrast between those helping the fire victims and those conspicuously absent from relief efforts spoke volumes. 2 days later, the Leadville Chronicle ran a front-page story detailing the heroic community response led by the Morgan Fund. Alongside it was a smaller article noting that a warrant had been issued for the arrest of one of Fletcher's known associates on suspicion of arson, though the man had apparently left town in haste. Harrison's mistake, Thomas observed as they read the paper over breakfast, was making this about more than just us. He's alienating the entire town. Rebecca nodded, but her expression remained troubled. He's also getting desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. Her words proved prophetic that very afternoon when Catherine Harrison arrived at their home, her face pale with urgency. "My father is coming," she said without preamble. "He left Denver yesterday with Fletcher and 6 armed men. He wasn't himself. He kept talking about making examples of you both." Thomas's expression turned grim. "How much time do we have?" "A day, perhaps less," Catherine replied. "I came as soon as I could slip away. He doesn't know I've warned you." Rebecca studied the younger woman. "Why risk this? He's your father." Catherine's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "Because I don't recognize him anymore, and because the man I once knew is gone." She swallowed hard. "What he did in California, he never told me. I found out when those newspaper stories broke. David Cooper was my godfather. His wife Mary was my mother's dearest friend." She looked directly at Thomas. "You were right to run. My father would have killed you too, just like he'll try to kill you now unless you stop him." The news of Harrison's approach spread through Leadville like wildfire. By evening, a meeting had convened in the town hall, crowded with miners, merchants, and ordinary citizens, all with a stake in what happened next. Sheriff Coleman, sweating profusely beneath his badge, looked out at the assembled faces. "Now, folks, we don't know for certain that Mr. Harrison means any harm. Don't we, Bay?" Morrison interrupted, standing from his seat in the front row. "My store's been boycotted. My supplies misdirected. Mary Wilkins was evicted from her home. The Morgan shop was vandalized. And now State Street burns just days after Fletcher was seen threatening Thomas Morgan in broad daylight." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "What do you propose then?" the sheriff asked. "I can't arrest a man for riding into town with his employees." Thomas stood. The room quieted immediately. "We don't need to arrest him," he said calmly. "We just need to show him that his tactics won't work here anymore, that Leadville stands together." Rebecca watched her husband with quiet pride. This was the true Thomas Morgan, not the silent trapper he'd pretended to be, nor the vengeful victim Harrison had made him, but a leader who understood that real strength came from community. Plans were made quickly. Lookouts were positioned on the trails leading into town. The telegraph operator would send messages to the territorial governor and the federal marshal in Denver at the first sign of trouble. And most importantly, the townspeople would present a united front. "Harrison believes he can isolate us," Rebecca told the gathering, "that people will abandon us to protect their own interests. Let's prove him wrong." The confrontation came at noon the next day. Harrison rode into Leadville at the head of a group of 8 men, all heavily armed. They made no pretense of peaceful intentions, their horses kicking up dust as they galloped down the main street. What they found waiting for them, however, was not what they expected. The street was lined with townspeople, miners still in their work clothes, shopkeepers in their aprons, women and children standing in doorways, silent, watching. And at the center of the street in front of the Morgan shop stood Thomas and Rebecca, flanked by Morrison, the mine operators who joined the Morgan Fund, and even Catherine Harrison herself. Harrison reined his horse to a stop, his face darkening with rage at the sight of his daughter among his enemies. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice carrying in the unnatural quiet. "A welcoming committee?" "Something like that," Thomas replied evenly. "Leadville has a message for you, Harrison." "I don't take messages from mining camps," Harrison spat. "I buy them." "Not this one." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, displaying more backbone than anyone had expected. "Mr. Harrison, I'm asking you and your men to dismount and surrender your weapons." Fletcher laughed. "On what charges, Sheriff?" "Conspiracy to commit arson, for starters," Coleman replied. "We have a witness who saw your man Jenkins leaving the Golden Nugget just before it went up in flames." "Preposterous," Harrison dismissed. "You have no proof." "We have enough for a warrant," the sheriff countered, producing an official-looking document. "And I'm serving it now." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "This is Morgan's doing. He's turned you all against me with lies and that charity of his." His gaze swept the crowd. "You fools, do you know who I am? What I can do to this town if you stand against me?" Rebecca stepped forward. "They know exactly who you are now, Mr. Harrison. A man who murders his partners for profit, who burns buildings with people inside them, who threatens widows and children." "Careful, Mrs. Morgan," Harrison warned. "Slander is a serious charge." "It's not slander if it's true," came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. A hush fell as the gathering parted to reveal a woman in her 40s, elegant despite the dust of travel on her clothes. Beside her stood a man of similar age, leaning heavily on a cane, his left leg visibly withered. Harrison's face went ashen. Matthew. Mary Cooper stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Harrison's face. "James Harrison, it's been 7 years since you killed my husband." "Mrs. Cooper," Harrison stammered, "this is a surprise. I was under the impression you had remained in California." "I did," she replied coldly, "until Thomas Morgan contacted me 6 months ago. Until he showed me evidence of what really happened in that mine. Until he helped Matthew find witnesses willing to testify." Matthew Price advanced slowly, each step clearly painful. "We trusted you, James. We brought you into our partnership because you had connections in San Francisco, and you repaid that trust with murder." Harrison's composure cracked. "This is absurd. You have no proof. It was an accident, a tragic accident." "We have more than you think," Thomas said quietly. He turned to Fletcher, "including documents that trace the money paid to sabotage those support beams. Money that passed through your hands, Fletcher." Fletcher's head snapped up, his face draining of color. "That's a lie! I never—" He stopped, catching himself too late. Harrison stared at his lieutenant, sudden realization dawning. "You knew," he whispered. "All this time, you knew I'd find out eventually." Fletcher's eyes darted between Harrison and the crowd. In that moment of hesitation, Thomas saw the fracture he needed. "It's over, Fletcher," Thomas called out. "Harrison will sacrifice you to save himself. He always does. But you have a choice now. Testify against him. Tell the truth about California, about the fire here in Leadville, and the territorial prosecutor will show leniency." Harrison's hand moved toward his coat where a pistol undoubtedly waited. "Don't you dare, Fletcher. Don't you—" "He ordered it," Fletcher blurted out, his survival instinct overriding years of loyalty. "The sabotage in California, the fire here, all of it. I have proof, letters, in his handwriting." Harrison drew his weapon with surprising speed, aiming not at Thomas or the sheriff, but at Fletcher. "You treacherous!" The shot rang out, echoing between the buildings. But it wasn't Harrison's gun that fired. From a second-floor window above the Morgan shop, a rifle barrel protruded, smoke curling from its end. The bullet struck Harrison's hand, sending his pistol spinning into the dust. Catherine Harrison stood in the window, her father's hunting rifle still braced against her shoulder. Her face was tear-streaked but determined. "Enough, father," she called down. "No more deaths, no more fires." In the confusion that followed, Sheriff Coleman and his deputies moved in, disarming Harrison's stunned men. Harrison himself clutched his bleeding hand, his expression a mixture of pain, rage, and disbelief as he stared up at his daughter. "You too?" he gasped. "My own flesh and blood?" "I'm protecting your soul," Catherine replied, her voice breaking. What's left of it? As Harrison was led away in handcuffs, the tension that had held the town in its grip for months began to dissipate. People turned to one another, relief evident in their faces. The crisis had passed, the threat neutralized. Rebecca found Thomas standing apart from the crowd, watching Harrison being escorted to the jail. It's really over, she said softly. Thomas shook his head. Not yet. There will be trials, testimonies. Harrison will fight with everything he has. But he'll fight in the open now. On our terms, not his. Are you ready for that? Rebecca smiled, touching his face gently. I'm ready for anything, as long as we face it together. The trial of James Harrison became the sensation of Colorado territory. Journalists came from as far as Chicago and San Francisco to cover the proceedings, drawn by the lurid combination of wealth, murder, and betrayal. The territorial courthouse in Denver could barely contain the crowd that gathered each day to watch the drama unfold. Harrison had hired the most expensive legal team money could buy, 3 attorneys from San Francisco who arrived with trunks of documents in a strategy based on discrediting the witnesses. The prosecution, led by a young but determined district attorney named William Hardin, built its case methodically. Fletcher, in exchange for leniency, provided detailed testimony about Harrison's methods, how he eliminated rivals, how he falsified land claims, how he ordered the sabotage that killed David Cooper and the others in California. Catherine Harrison's testimony, however, proved most damaging. She described years of watching her father's moral decline, of being used as a pawn in his schemes, of the night she overheard him ordering Fletcher to make sure the Morgans learned their lesson, just days before the Leadville fire. Did he specifically mention fire? Harrison's lawyer asked during cross-examination. No, Catherine admitted. He said, I don't care how you do it, just make it hurt. So you have no direct knowledge that your father ordered arson? Catherine looked directly at her father. I know my father. I know what he meant. When Thomas took the stand, Harrison's attorneys attempted to portray him as a vengeful competitor, intent on destroying their client. You've been planning this for years, haven't you, Mr. Morgan? The lead attorney pressed. Gathering information, building a case, waiting for your moment to strike? I've been gathering evidence, Thomas corrected. Evidence of crimes that should have been prosecuted years ago. And you married a seamstress to help you in this vendetta? Rebecca, sitting in the gallery, felt her cheeks flush with anger. Thomas's response was measured. I married Rebecca Wilson because she was the strongest, most capable woman I'd ever met. The fact that she helped expose Harrison's crimes speaks to her character, not mine. On the trial's 9th day, the prosecution called Mary Cooper. The widow's testimony about the California mine collapse, about her husband's suspicions regarding Harrison, about the letters David had sent her just days before his death, expressing concern over Harrison's pressure to cut costs, brought many in the courtroom to tears. Through it all, Harrison sat stoically, his injured hand bandaged, his face revealing nothing. Only when Matthew Price described dragging himself from the collapsed mine shaft, his leg crushed, calling for friends who would never answer, did Harrison show emotion. A momentary twitch of his eye, quickly suppressed. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for less than a day. We find the defendant, James Harrison, guilty on all counts. The sentence came a week later, 20 years in the territorial prison. As Harrison was led from the courtroom, he paused beside Thomas and Rebecca. This isn't over, he said softly, his voice devoid of its former power but still carrying menace. You've taken everything from me. I'll do the same to you, if it takes the rest of my life. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. You're wrong, Mr. Harrison. You lost everything yourself through your own choices. Harrison's appeals would begin immediately, filed from his prison cell with dogged persistence. But the day of the verdict marked the end of his power. Within months, his mining empire began to crumble. Assets were seized to pay restitution to his victims. Companies were sold off to competitors. His name became synonymous with corruption, a cautionary tale whispered among ambitious men throughout the West. For Leadville, Harrison's fall brought unexpected prosperity. With his monopolistic practices ended, smaller mining operations flourished. The town grew, attracting new businesses and families. At the heart of this renaissance stood Morgan's fine tailoring and dressmaking and the Morgan Fund, institutions that came to represent the community's resilience. Catherine Harrison faced perhaps the most difficult transition. Cut off from her father's fortune but liberated from his control, she found herself adrift until Rebecca extended an unexpected olive branch. "You have a natural eye for design," Rebecca told her one afternoon studying Catherine's sketches. "I could use someone with your talent if you're interested in an apprenticeship." Catherine accepted with grateful humility. "Why help me after everything my father did?" "You chose differently," Rebecca replied simply. "That's all any of us can do." Their partnership proved fruitful. Catherine's refined sensibilities complemented Rebecca's practical approach, attracting a clientele that extended beyond Leadville to Denver's emerging society. Monthly, Catherine made the journey to the territorial prison, though her father refused to see her. "He sees my testimony as the ultimate betrayal," she confided to Rebecca. "But I'll keep trying. He's still my father." Rebecca squeezed the younger woman's hand. "That kind of loyalty takes courage." In the decade following Harrison's conviction, Thomas and Rebecca's influence grew throughout the territory. The tailoring business expanded into Denver and Central City. The Morgan Fund evolved from emergency relief to sustainable community development. Thomas, his true background now public knowledge, was elected to the town council, where his business acumen and integrity earned respect from former rivals. His focus shifted from personal success to creating opportunities for others, particularly those disadvantaged by the boom and bust cycle of mining life. Rebecca established a training program for women seeking financial independence. Many of her first students were widows like herself, women who had followed husbands west only to find themselves alone in a harsh land. Under her guidance, they learned not just tailoring skills, but business management, accounting, and negotiation. On their 5th anniversary, a real celebration unlike their hasty wedding, Thomas presented Rebecca with the deed to a new building on Harrison Avenue, renamed Morgan Avenue by popular vote. "For someone who doesn't need taking care of," he said with a smile, "you've managed to care for half the town." Rebecca's eyes brimmed with unexpected tears. "We built something better than revenge." Their first child, Elizabeth, arrived in the spring of 1885, a daughter with her mother's determined spirit and her father's thoughtful eyes. 3 years later, James joined the family, a quieter soul who observed the world with careful attention. From the beginning, Thomas and Rebecca raised their children with an awareness of the values they'd fought for: courage, integrity, and community. The Morgan home became known for its warmth and inclusion, where miners' children received the same respect as bankers' sons, where ideas and books flowed freely. During this period, Fletcher completed his reduced sentence and surprisingly chose to remain in Colorado. With Thomas's cautious endorsement, he found work managing a small mine, his knowledge of Harrison's operations proving valuable to operations determined not to repeat those mistakes. Mary Cooper returned to California but maintained correspondence with the Morgans. Matthew Price, after years of rehabilitation, established a law practice in San Francisco specializing in mining claims and workers' rights, a direct response to the exploitation he had witnessed. Harrison himself remained in prison, his appeals consistently denied but never abandoned. Reports from guards described him as a model prisoner who spent hours writing legal briefs and reading business journals. He still refused Catherine's visits, but began accepting her letters, a small crack in his wall of bitterness. By her 15th birthday, Elizabeth Morgan had announced her intention to become a physician, a shocking ambition for a girl in the 1890s, but one her parents supported without hesitation. "People will say it's impossible," Thomas warned her gently. "People said it was impossible for Mother to outmaneuver James Harrison," Elizabeth replied with a grin. "I come from practical people who don't much care about impossible." James, more reserved than his sister, found his calling in the law. "I want to understand how the law can protect people," he explained when announcing his intention to study at Harvard. "How it can be a shield for the vulnerable rather than a weapon for the powerful." As their children pursued education in the East, Thomas and Rebecca gradually stepped back from active management of their businesses. Their focus shifted to mentoring the next generation of leaders in Leadville. The cabin in the mountains, once a place of hiding and secrets, became a summer retreat where the family gathered, telling and retelling the story of how it all began. 20 years after Harrison's conviction, as the Morgans celebrated their silver wedding anniversary, News arrived from Denver. Harrison, now an old man, had died in prison. His final appeal, still pending before the federal court, would never be decided. "How do you feel?" Thomas asked Rebecca privately that evening after the celebrations had ended. Rebecca considered the question. "Sad," she said finally. Not for Harrison himself, but for the life he wasted. All that intelligence, all that drive. Imagine what he could have accomplished if he'd used it to build rather than destroy. Thomas nodded. That's the choice, isn't it? To build or to destroy, to isolate or to connect. "We chose well," Rebecca said simply. The Morgan name became synonymous with integrity and community throughout Colorado territory. The small tailoring shop had grown into a successful business network, while the Morgan Fund supported not just mining families but education initiatives and healthcare projects throughout the region. For Thomas and Rebecca, however, their greatest achievement remained the family they had created and the values they had instilled. As the new century dawned, their legacy continued to expand through their children's achievements. Elizabeth completed her medical training, becoming one of Colorado's first female physicians. She established a clinic serving mining communities where women and children received care regardless of their ability to pay. James distinguished himself at Harvard Law before returning to Colorado, specializing in cases involving land claims and miners' rights. He married the daughter of a Denver judge and started his own family, carrying the Morgan values forward. When the final Harrison appeal came before the federal court 30 years after the original conviction, it was James Morgan who presented the argument against it. Standing before the judges in Denver, he spoke not with personal animosity, but with a clear commitment to justice. "This case is not merely about one man's crimes," he told the court. "It represents a choice about what kind of society we wish to build in the West. One where power and wealth can override the law, or one where every person, however humble their origins, can find justice." The court ruled unanimously to uphold Harrison's conviction. The decades-long legal battle was finally over. That evening, 12-year-old William, James's eldest son, raced to his grandparents' home with the telegram bearing the news. He found Thomas on the porch, the old Winchester rifle across his lap, a relic kept not for protection now, but as a reminder of harder days long past. "Grandpa, they've reached a verdict," William called, taking the porch steps two at a time. Thomas looked up, his weathered face crinkling in a smile. "Let me see, young man." His hands, once steady enough to track game through miles of wilderness, now trembled slightly with age as he read the message. Rebecca emerged from the house, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Is that from James?" she asked, coming to sit beside her husband. "Yes," Thomas replied, passing her the telegram. The court rejected Harrison's final appeal. "It's over, truly over." "Grandpa," William asked, his young face earnest, "why was this so important to Dad? He worked on it for years." Thomas exchanged a glance with Rebecca. How to explain to a child born into security the significance of justice long delayed? "Your father understands something important," Thomas said carefully, "that the stories we tell, the examples we set, shape the world our children inherit. This wasn't just about a man who did wrong things long ago. It was about showing that in the end, truth matters." "Will you tell me the story again?" William asked. "About how you and Grandma met? About how you built everything?" Rebecca smiled, touching Thomas's hand. Some stories were worth retelling, worth preserving, as reminders of what was possible when courage and community overcame fear and isolation. "Well," Thomas began, settling back in his chair, "it was the winter of 1873 and the snow was falling thick as goose feathers over Leadville. As twilight deepened into night, 3 generations of Morgans gathered on that porch, bound together by a legacy built not on fear or exploitation, but on courage, integrity, and love. In the vast Colorado wilderness where fortunes rose and fell like the seasons, theirs was a story the mountains would remember. A tale of 2 people who had gambled everything on each other and created something far greater than either could have imagined alone. It was, in the end, a love story, not just between 2 people, but between those people and the community they helped create. A story still being written with each generation, each challenge faced together, each moment of choosing to build rather than destroy. And that was a legacy worth more than all the silver in Colorado.